Thanks very much. This is what I look like online. This is where you can find me. And this is what I looked like 2 years ago. I was a complete mess. In the space of 3 months, I gained 30 kilos and lost 15. I was going through roughly a packet of cigarettes a day, and on a good day, a bottle of whiskey might last 2 days. And the reason for this was that. Anybody who knows the little green Pac-Man icon, that's a coupe scooter. I was part of the launch team. We launched in Berlin 2 years ago. It's subsequently got bigger than that. It's gone off to other cities as well. In project management, people talk about the quality, cost, time triangle. If you're delivering a project, you can have quality, cost, time, pick any two, and the third one goes by the way. In my case, had the quality, we shipped the products, had the time, we shipped on time. The cost was for me. This is how I looked like at the start of the project. That's what I looked like at the end of it. And the reason was very simple. I burnt out. So this is a product person's guide to burnout and how to hack it. Now, we'll talk about what burnout is, what causes it, and then hopefully, by the end, figure out some quick ways to hack it. However, I shall make a caveat that I am not a doctor, and I'm not a psychiatrist, and I'm also not a scientist. So basically, you can fall asleep for the next 20 minutes and come out the end of it without any problems. And if some of the things I'm going to talk to you about tonight trigger you or are somehow problematic, well, you just have to sue me. Okay, so let's look at the origins. What do we actually mean by burnout? And this comes from some research that kicked off in round about the mid-1960s in the health field. Some researchers in psychology departments of American universities were looking to see why there were increasing levels of staff turnover in medical institutions, particularly amongst the nursing staff. So they did lots of various controlled experiments. Ethics weren't really the strong thing in the 60s, so they could get away with all kinds of horrible things that you can't do now. At the same time, teams of research was looking at very similar patterns of behavior in the teaching profession. People would come into the teaching profession with great ideas about how they were going to change the world and raise the next generation of wonderful children, and then within a space of a few months, they turned into Mrs. Crabapple. And what the researchers discovered was there were 3 traits that kind of describe what's going on here. The first one was an idea of emotional exhaustion. It was I just don't care anymore. I've had enough. I'm just going to put the time in and go home at the end of the day and forget about it all. And that went along with a detached attitude, particularly in the medical profession. Rather than thinking of patients as being people, nursing staff tended to think of patients as just being collections of symptoms, bags of meat with things that had gone wrong with them. And the third factor was a feeling of low sense of achievement. I'm not getting anything done here. It doesn't matter what I do. These kids are going to turn into little monsters regardless. I might just as well give up and go home. And that leads to poor performance, obviously. If you have a nurse who looks at you as if you are just an interesting disease rather than a person, that's probably not going to be too great. And I'm sure we've all experienced less than great teachers in our school days. But more worryingly, it turns out that this kind of thing is a gateway to some really quite serious medical problems, anxiety and depression. And these are real things. These are real problems. They are, if untreated, potentially fatal diseases. Which then made the researchers start to ask the question about, well, okay, what's the cause of this? And the cause they discovered is chronic long-term stress. Okay, so we've just taken a whole bunch of words and replaced them with some more words. Doesn't really help. So let's try and unpack this. What do we actually mean by stress? So we go to Wikipedia. It's a noun. It's a pressure or tension exerted on a material object. No, it doesn't really sound relevant. It's a state of mental or emotional strain or tension resulting from adverse or demanding circumstances. Okay, that sounds like we're onto something here. He's obviously under a lot of stress. How many times have you heard that statement? And stress can manifest itself from a number of different causes, but you can categorize them into some group headings. Firstly, you have acute physical crises. I've fallen over and I've broken my leg. I've fallen off my bike underneath a tram. Those kind of acute physical crises. You can then also have chronic physical crises. I've got some kind of chronic illness or chronic condition that is causing me stress. And in most situations in our daily lives, we hopefully don't fall under trams very often, and most of us are relatively healthy, give or take the odd bout of illness. What's far more likely is that we are operating under a series of psychological and social disruptions. And there's actually a table of these. And it's a table that scores all the various different things that could happen to you in your life on a scale of 0, which is like no stress at all, to 100, which is, I don't know, pretty fucking stressful. And if you look at it, there's some interesting ones here. Death of a spouse, I mean, that's fairly traumatic. Your life partner is no longer here. That's going to be stressful. Marriage is half as stressful as the person dying. But actually, when you think about it, it's a major life change. Yeah, there's going to be stress from that. Pregnancy, I mean, not something I had to confront personally, but I can imagine that's going to be stressful. But the interesting thing is, if we strip out all the personal related things and we just look at the work related ones, there's some great ones here. Dismissal from work, yeah, okay, you get fired, pretty stressful. But change to a different line of work isn't something that just happens and it bounces off you. All of these things add up. So if that's the case and we are operating in this condition of stressful situations day in, day out, what can we actually do about it? So, time for some science. Bearing in mind, I'm not a scientist. So, meet the central nervous system. I'm just going to go and get some water. The central nervous system, that's basically the thing that keeps us alive. It's the thing up here, it's the brain, and it's the communication channel, the spinal cord, which sort of runs down and links up all the other bits. And actually, we're not particularly interested in this because it's not actually all that relevant when we're talking about stress. What's far more interesting is the autonomic nervous system. And the autonomic nervous system is basically responsible for running, it's what's called the smooth muscles. So that's things like legs, but also things like gut as well. Your gut is basically one great big muscle, squeezes the food from one end to the other, hopefully in that order, not always. The autonomic nervous system, and this was something that was touched on earlier, has two parts to it, the parasympathetic and the sympathetic. And as Jonas said, they can basically be divided into the fight and flight and the rest and digest. But the interesting thing about the human nervous system is basically it's one massive hack. Because if you look at the rate of our evolution versus the rate of our societal and technological development, basically we're running our modern society on some really, really old software. And most, if not all, of the psychological problems that occur in Western societies can be traced back to this fact that we're running around with brains that aren't really designed for what we're wanting them to do. And the reason for that is that there are three parts of the human brain. At the top, round the outside, they're kind of like Russian dolls. They sort of nest within each other. If there's any neuroscientists in the room at this point, they're probably chewing the bench in front of them because this is such a gross simplification. But anyway, it'll work for us. The neocortex, that's the bit that makes us human. That's the bit of consciousness and music and art and all the things that basically distinguish us from, well, from apes and other sort of lower life forms. But right down at the bottom is what's known as the reptilian brain. It's the really sort of core bit. It's the bit that keeps us alive. And the reason it's called the reptilian brain is because reptiles only have that, which leads to an interesting line of thought. I don't know if we have any iguana fanciers here this evening. Any heptophiles? Sounds like something you should be arrested for, but apparently. If you are, I hate to break it to you, but your iguana doesn't love you. Your iguana doesn't cuddle up to you because it's somehow some emotional connection. It cuddles up to you because you're warm, basically. Iguanas, reptiles, don't have the brain circuitry for concepts like affection. Basically, they're looking at you and thinking, can I eat you? And this brings us on to the way that the reptilian brain works. And this has been divided up. It's known as the 4 Fs. The 4 Fs are how you can deal with a stressful situation. And basically, any situation you can think of, anything at all, can be dealt with in one of 4 different ways. The first one is you can freeze. Now, paleontologists believe, I don't know how, that Tyrannosaurus rex had very poor eyesight and was only capable of detecting movement. So a very good survival strategy the next time you are faced with a T-Rex is to freeze. It won't see you, it will lose interest and go somewhere else. So that's freezing. The other thing you can do is you can flight. If you're attacked by a bear, you only need to be as fast as the slowest person in the group because you don't have to outrun the bear. Think about it. The other thing you can do, if it's a small bear, is you can fight. That is in response to a threat, a fight response, trying to neutralize the threat in some way is perfectly reasonable. And the 4th F is reproduction. And you wouldn't believe how much Googling that image took to find. So the question is, given these 4 responses, how does that work when we apply that to us as human beings? And basically what this comes down to is the physical responses to fight or flight. Now, the fun thing is that I can trigger this. I can make you have a fight or flight response. So what I want you to do is to concentrate very, very hard on the screen. Watch the screen. Congratulations. You have just experienced hypothalamic release of corticotropin releasing factor binding to CRS receptors on the anterior pituitary gland, causing adrenocorticotropic hormone to be released and bind to receptors on the adrenal cortex to stimulate adrenal release into cortisol. What the hell does that mean? Basically, what that involves is getting energy to where it's needed. What's happened when you've seen that is that your brain has released adrenaline into your blood system. And adrenaline is doing a number of things. One thing it's doing is it's ordering your liver to release glucose, because glucose is one of the things that your muscles need in order to burn to produce energy. The other thing that adrenaline is doing is it's increasing your heart rate. You might not have been aware of increasing heart rates when you're sitting there. I'm just looking at my heart rate now, and because I'm standing up in front of a really hostile audience, my heart rate is 20 beats a minute higher than it was when I was standing at the back listening to Jonas. Jonas's heart rate is probably back to where it was earlier on today. He looks pretty cool, doesn't he? Respiration increases. You start to breathe deeper and faster to get more oxygen into your bloodstream. All of which is about maximizing your chances of getting away. The other thing that happens is that your senses become sharpened. You're acutely aware of what's going on. There are selective improvements to your memory. You can focus on things, the possibility of getting away. How tall is that tree? Can I get up there before the bear arrives? And your pain threshold increases. And this is, you hear stories of people whose limbs have been torn off by machinery, who then pick up the severed limb and walk 3 kilometers to the nearest emergency room and calmly place the limb on the desk and said, "I'd like that reattached, please." The pain threshold. The other thing that happens when you're in this aroused state is that you start to defer long-term expensive stuff, like digestion. If you're about to be eaten by a bear, then digesting the hot dog you had 20 minutes ago probably doesn't make a lot of sense. So what happens is that your digestion shuts down as blood diverts elsewhere. Your immune system gets suppressed. Again, it's about long-term deferral. Who really cares if you're attacked by a virus at this precise moment if you're running away from something with very sharp teeth? Likewise, there's not a lot of point in reproducing at this stage if you're running away. And this leads us to the basic problem that we have as humans. We activate acute, short-term responses in response to chronic, long-term situations. And if you don't believe me, this is the working environment we all aspire to, right? The beautiful office with a view of, I have no idea where it is, but a view of somewhere. This is what we actually get. Actual footage shot earlier on this afternoon in a building very near to you. All of those short-term responses have costs associated with them. If your heart is constantly at an elevated level, you're at risk of hypertension, high blood pressure. Blood glucose, elevated levels of that is putting you at risk of type 2 diabetes in the long term. Irritable bowel syndrome, constant minor illnesses, loss of libido, and all the way down to the real biggies at the bottom, things like anxiety and depression. So, we're doomed. That's it. There's nothing we can do. We are fundamentally misadapted to the modern world. we might just as well wait for Trump to push the big red button and go home. Well, actually, there's a few things that we can do to hack this. First of all, there are some crappy ways. Alcohol. Yeah, that's a really crappy way. There's an increasing body of research which says that alcohol is actually as damaging as smoking to your long-term health, even at very, very low levels, which is not news you want to hear. Tobacco, again, even more dangerous than we thought it was previously, even at very, very low levels. You can get really exciting. You can go for the narcotics route, which comes with its own risks and rewards. Or you can just go for masochism and just power through it. But all of these are not especially good ways of handling with this. There are, in fact, some better ways. And let's just take a very quick spin through some of those. This one is actually incredibly simple and incredibly underrated. Good friend of mine is a psychiatric nurse. She deals with acute psychiatric patients who are brought in incredible distress. And one of the most effective tools that they have at their disposal is just letting people get caught up on their sleep. There is a very good reason why sleep deprivation is banned under the Geneva Convention as a form of torture. If I need to get you to give up the passwords, I'm not going to beat you with a rubber hose. I'm just going to stick you in a room and keep you awake for 72 hours, and then you'll tell me whatever you want, whatever I want to know. Eating properly, okay, it sounds like something that your mom would tell you, but one of the interesting things about the stress response is that it makes us crave high sugar, high levels of glucose-based foods, high carbohydrate foods, because they're energy dense. The problem with those is if you're in the business of consuming huge quantities of very high carb, very high glucose level foods over a long period of time, that's a great way to get yourself on the road to diabetes. Moving, this is, again, something that sounds very obvious, but actually has some hardcore science behind it. This is the idea of the runner's high. When you just, your feet grow wings and you can go for forever, it's because your body is producing endorphins, which have kind of the same effect in your brain as opiates. So it's kind of like legal highs. And focusing, which actually brings us back to something that Jonas was talking about, because we've seen that before. Only I'm going to give it a proper name. I'm going to call it the Yerkes-Dodson Law. Yeah. What Yerkes and Dodson did, they're two people. What Yerkes and Dodson did, they did some research that plotted people's effectiveness, their performance, against their level of arousal, in other words, their stress. And they discovered exactly what Jonas was talking about earlier. But the interesting thing is you can take this and you can use it for yourself. So if I plot my responses onto this, if I have very low levels of stress, I don't have any kind of deadlines to hit, or there's no real pressure or anything like that, I'm a bit bored, to be honest. I kind of need something to kind of get me going. Douglas Adams once said, I love the sound of deadlines. I love deadlines. I love the sound, the whooshing sound they make as they go past. I put a lot of these slides together last night because pressure, there's nothing like a deadline to make you get on with it. Okay, bit more pressure, bit more arousal. Yep, getting there. And then finally, yep, this is it. I'm absolutely in the zone now. But then it tips over and I have absolutely no recollection of going to the Späti and buying cigarettes. But suddenly I'm outside smoking. And from there, it's onto the whiskey, and then eventually it just sort of off it goes. So what you can do is you can actually plot your own response onto this and think about your behaviours and ask yourself when they occur, because that leads us into a couple of psychological hacks. The first one is called labelling. If you label an emotion, it's actually proven to reduce the impact. If you can describe it in a word or two, why is this happening? What effect is this having on me? It's giving you some ownership and is tricking your subconscious mind into giving you a little bit more leverage on it. And another powerful technique for that is reframing, which is to stand back and try and look at the situation from someone else's point of view. There's a phrase that you'll hear if you've ever gone through the 7-step process that Alcoholics Anonymous use. My whiskey consumption never got quite that bad, but it's useful to know. And they have a phrase which goes something like don't measure yourself from how you feel on the inside, measure yourself on how people perceive you from the outside. And describing the situation from someone else's point of view is actually proven to be a very useful technique, which leads into the 3 control questions. If you're feeling overwhelmed, if you are in a stressful situation, you can ask yourself 3 things. What don't I control? I have absolutely no control over Brexit. It's just going to happen. It's going to be a car crash, but there's nothing I can do about it. I voted Remain. That was 2 years ago. That's all I can do. What am I trying to control? What are the things that I can actually have a difference on? And then the third piece is, what could I control that I'm not currently controlling? And by trying to move things either into the outside circle, those are things that you can't deal with, or move them into the middle circle and control, it's again giving this sense of agency and a sense that you are not just a passive participant being blown along in life. You actually have some control. That's at quite a high level. There's also some things you can do at a fairly low level to hack your sympathetic nervous system. And they're actually surprisingly low tech. Breathing. Now, anybody who doesn't believe me, you really should just try this. Breathe in for 5 seconds, and then breathe out for 5 seconds. And just do that for 2 minutes, and you will find your heart rate comes down by 25-30%. There's even if you're an Apple Watch wearer, there's even an app on the Apple Watch that you can use that sort of times you and gives you sort of haptic feedback. But this is a technique that's used clinically to reduce panic attacks. Get the person having the panic attack to concentrate on their breathing. Because then you move up to the next step, which is you breathe in for 4 seconds, and you hold it for 1 second, and then you breathe out over the 4 seconds again. And you do that for 2 minutes. And before you know it, you've brought your stress levels right down. There's also leads into the area of mindfulness, and there are apps for this that help you concentrate and get into exactly that kind of flow scenario that we've talked about earlier. So, burnout is basically another word for chronic long-term stress. Stress is basically just a very, very old behavior that we've evolved to use in fight or flight situations. You can learn to manage your sympathetic nervous system. So you may start the project looking like this. You might used to end up looking like this. But as you can see, this is how I am today. It works.